So what we're going to talk about today is this concept that is a little antithetical to the talk you just heard. But essentially, what the thesis of today's presentation is going to be around is the fact that you're focused a little bit too much specifically on acquisition as the main driver of growth. Now, in kind of the very tumultuous times that apparently we're heading in terms of VC funding, et cetera, this is going to start to be something that we're going to start to see a lot more in not only growth presentations, but also just around people trying to have better unit economics, mainly because this focus on acquisition, at least what we've found in the data, has two really, really bad implications. One, you start to be really inefficient with the growth that you guys have within your organizations. And two, you end up leaving a considerable amount of customers and also revenue on the table. So I understand this is a bit of a bold claim from someone who's not in a sport coat at the conference today. But the context that we have here is we run a company called Price Intelligently. And with Price Intelligently, we have two main pieces of software. One is a price optimization suite of tools, and then the other is a SaaS metrics for your billing system product. Now, through both of those products, we've actually been able to see inside more SaaS companies than basically anyone else out there, at least from a financial perspective. So on the Price Intelligently side of the books, we're able to see everything from top of the funnel metrics all the way through post-conversion metrics. And then on the profit well side of the house, we've essentially been able to see inside tons and tons of companies around where they're actually getting their growth, and more specifically, how they're doing in terms of growth. And just to kind of quantify that a little bit, what we've seen inside is about 1,000 SaaS companies at this point. And to give you some context, that's about 1/5 of all meaningful revenue SaaS companies out there right now. There's about 5,000 companies that have about 500,000 ARR or more. And that's about 1/10 of all of the SaaS companies in existence, or at least the main estimates that we're seeing in the market. So essentially, as we started building the company, we started to notice that there was these two main groups that started to emerge, particularly on these companies that were on kind of a growth path and not really looking to necessarily be just a value business. The first group that we qualitatively saw, we called them the LTV beasts. I don't know why they're called the LTV beasts. I think an intern came up with that particular name. But what we noticed about these companies, and just to give you some examples, we see this as like a Wistia out in Boston, video hosting and analytics. A little more popular companies like Atlassian. These particular companies, they typically have small to no sales teams. They are typically low amounts of funding relative to their size. And they also know their unit economics and buyer personas cold. So when you walk in there, you can pretty much ask anyone at the company, how are you doing on your compass metric and how are your personas? And they can give you just a list of answers, as well as really, really specific details around who they're going after, as well as how growth is actually happening in the company. The second group that we found were the CAC fiends, or customer acquisition cost fiends. Now, these particular companies are about 95% of the companies that we actually see. And these are characterized by essentially the antithesis of the lifetime value beasts. They have enormous sales teams. You walk in and you ask, hey, how many people work here? Oh, there's 700 people and 400 of them are salespeople. They've raised more money than God relative to their size, just hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, or at least a really, really high proportion to their overall revenue. And their unit economics are really not top of mind, nor do they necessarily know how they're calculating their unit economics. So we had a customer who was on the IPO warpath. They contacted us about 9 months before their IPO to help them with their pricing. They were calculating MRR incorrectly. It was really, really surprising, and it's not a GAAP metric, so it's not like you have to have it calculated correctly, but it definitely helped them get that number in order, especially when they went on their road shows and started talking about what was going on. And the other part of this, number 3, is really they don't know their buyer personas. So when we ask those types of companies like, hey, who are your buyers? We get answers like, developers. Oh, what kind of developers? And there's no other detail that a lot of people can give unless they go to that person who's been there for 5, 6 years and get all kinds of details. And so qualitatively, we started seeing this, and just to recap, we saw 95% of the companies that we were talking to were essentially of the customer acquisition cost group, whereas 5% were the folks who were really, really focused on their unit economics. And so we wanted to kind of qualify, like, is this something that's real in kind of the ether? Like, are they just coming to us because they need help? And also, like, is this whole concept of being very, really CAC-driven something that we're seeing in our growth culture? And so to do that, we actually did an anthropological study on blog posts. And the reason we chose blog posts is because, well, it's two reasons. The first is we write about what we know. A lot of times when we're trying to push content out there, we're essentially writing the little tactics that we've learned. And then we also found out that this is really driven by demand, right? So if a blog post about the 100 tactics that was referenced in the previous talk does really, really well, we're going to write more of those types of blog posts, and that's going to kind of guide where we're headed. So we looked at around 10,000 blog posts, and we took out all of the kind of general posts about business, things about culture, the 4,000 posts about transparency in business, and a number of other posts, and we basically focused on all of the blog posts that were written essentially in 2015 and part of 2014 on how to actually grow your business from a dollar amount or a user acquisition perspective. And what we found is when we broke this down into three of the main SaaS categories of acquisition, monetization, and retention, is that almost 7 out of 10 blog posts, or over 7 out of 10 blog posts, were written on acquisition. Just over 2 out of 10 blog posts were written on retention, and under half out of every 10 blog posts was written on monetization. And for better or for worse, most of those were written by Price Intelligently. Now, what's interesting about this is that this doesn't necessarily prove that acquisition's a problem, right? It shows, or at least correlates to the fact that what we're writing about is all about acquisition, which kind of puts us in that CAC group. And so we wanted to explore this concept even further, particularly around proving out why acquisition isn't the most effective channel, particularly for growth. And so we set out to answer the question, if we look at those three groups or three pillars of SaaS, acquisition, monetization, and retention, and we improved all three of those at the same rate, what would be the impact on the bottom line for the business? And when I say bottom line, I'm referring specifically to dollar bills. I'm not referring to more acquisition. I'm not referring to some of the more investment metrics that you're going after, but really what's going on when we improve those different axes of SaaS. And so we built a model out using all the data that we had, and we essentially looked at not only kind of the relative improvements, like physically improving your conversion rate by a percentage, physically improving your price by a percentage, and physically improving your retention by a percentage, but we also looked at the compounding factors for each of these axes. So theoretically, if you improve your retention, you're also improving your word of mouth. If you improve your acquisition, you're also improving your brand. So we put this all together, and there's more details in a blog post on how this actual model breaks down for anyone who's interested. But what we started to find is that percent improvements, particularly in acquisition, resulted in a 3.3% boost in the bottom line. This was relative to another percentage boost in retention, looking at a 6.7% boost in the bottom line. And then as the talk is kind of momentum building towards, a 1% improvement in monetization equated to almost a 13% boost in the bottom line. So the point here isn't necessarily the relative kind of boost of acquisition, retention, and monetization, but it's kind of the relationship of the different axes and relative improvements on all of them that's really, really important to look at. Because what you're seeing is that improving your retention and your monetization has 2 to 4x the impact of focusing in on acquisition. So this was interesting to us, and we wanted to dive a little bit further on some of the efficiency metrics, because this kind of shows at least where you're focusing your time might not necessarily be in the best place. Of course, you have to have a distribution strategy. Of course, you have to be bringing those customers in. But we wanted to look also at companies over time, how they were doing on kind of their main compass metric of the LTV to CAC ratio. So for those of you who don't know, LTV to CAC is essentially one of kind of the God metrics in SaaS for measuring efficiency of how many customers you're bringing through the door and how much they're worth to you over essentially how much they cost for you to bring them in. Now, what was interesting is we looked at those institutions that had actual pricing organizations, or at least a pricing review every year, that kind of correlating to this monetization point. And what we found is that those companies, and this is a group of about 100 with ARR greater than 5 million, those folks who had no pricing function, they hadn't changed their prices in years, LTV to CAC of just under 2. Those folks who had a yearly pricing review, just over 3. And then those folks who had continual price optimization defined as a review of their pricing every quarter or every 6 months, LTV to CAC of 11.09. And just for context, 3 is essentially the magic benchmark that folks like David Skock and other SaaS folks kind of say that's what we're looking for in a really profitable business. So this is interesting to us, particularly because this is something that we saw qualitatively, and although this is very correlated type data, it's definitely pointing to the fact that we're like dogs chasing cars. We really, really want customers, and we're chasing them, but once we get them, we're not really sure what to do with them in terms of not only monetization, but also in terms of retention. And for those of you who know, yes, I did just quote the Joker from Batman, if anyone got the reference. And even further than that, to kind of bring it home a little bit more, our focus on growth is like a sledgehammer. We're essentially throwing so much at growth in terms of acquisition that we're not thinking about the efficiency of those particular customers, and we're also not thinking about how we're actually going to charge those customers once we get them. So what I want to do a little bit for the rest of the talk is kind of go through a few things that you can do to kind of focus on your monetization a little bit more. Can't teach SaaS pricing, can't teach SaaS retention in the next 10 minutes, but there's a few very, very key processes and frameworks that you can use to start thinking about this and iterating it on in your business, just like your acquisition strategy and just like the rest of your product and customer development. And those fall on 3 axes: quantifying your buyer personas, implementing a pricing process, and utilizing what's known as a multi-price mindset. So buyer personas feels like a pretty pedantic piece of advice, right? Like HubSpot wrote about that like 10 years ago, right? But just as a little thought experiment, and this might backfire completely, how many of your companies have actual buyer personas written out somewhere in your business? Okay. And they might have cute names, like little avatars, like Startup Steve or Enterprise Eddie, stuff like that. Now keep your hands raised just for a second. Now, of those who have buyer personas, how many of them are correlated to your unit economics? So meaning, Startup Steve has this ACV, the LTV, the CAC of all your different buyer personas. Keep your hands raised if you do. That's good. I don't even need to ask further questions because we're already so sparse, in terms of the room. But really, you need your buyer personas to be known cold. When we walk into companies that have amazing LTV to CAC ratios and are also just growing hand over fist, they essentially have not only all of these metrics, but even more extra color around their actual buyer personas. And the reason that this is so important is because when you look at your pricing page, whether it's a physical page on your website, whether it's a rate card, whether it's something else where you have to have an enterprise sales negotiation, no matter what the manifestation of your pricing page looks like, everything that you're doing in your business, from your sales and your marketing all the way to your product and operations, is being used to drive someone to this page, justify the price, and then keep justifying the price after conversion so that they keep coming back. And to summarize that a little bit differently, if you don't know who you're driving to that page, how are you going to know what to put on that page? Something that's very, very important to think about. And if someone asks you who your buyer personas are, you should know more than just the top-level generic look at who they actually are. So helping out a little bit further, and that's kind of the initial foundation of getting your pricing right, as well as the initial foundation of, I would argue, getting your retention right as well, is implementing a pricing process. Now, this doesn't have to be something that's extremely complicated, but it should be an iterative framework, very similar to the growth framework that was presented in the previous talk. Just as another thought experiment, what do you think the average amount of time spent on pricing strategy in a business is? Give me a number. Give me like an hours. How many? I can't hear anyone. 1,000 hours? 10 hours? All right, it's 8 hours. So we found that I believe it was around 300 companies we polled for that particular case. And whenever I hear that from folks, I'm just like, hey, your product's improved, right? Well, then why isn't your pricing improved? And so we noticed that a lot of companies lack commitment, expertise, and process or framework around their pricing. They're only spending those 8 hours. And what's interesting about pricing in and of itself is it really isn't hard. It is truly just a process. You have to approach it very, very similar to the rest of your customer development process. And ultimately, you should be evaluating your pricing every 3 months and making changes every 6 months. So it doesn't have to be a major change. Doesn't mean you're changing your actual physical number of your price on your page, but you should be adjusting your value metric, you should be adding add-ons, you should be changing the different feature packages, just need to be changing something with your pricing and utilizing it as one of those core fulcrums of growth. In particular, this is what we see as a very, very common kind of pricing framework. Each quarter, and this doesn't necessarily mean anyone's dedicated full time to this, basically you're doing customer and market research based on a couple of hypotheses that you have. After you get that research, you're making a decision, and then finally putting it into practice. And so you should be running pricing experiments essentially every quarter. What we typically see is the best use case for actually pushing these tests forward is using a pricing committee. And the main reason is because pricing is so central, like everyone kind of touches it in some way. And so you need someone who's going to be the main coordinator, and then rolls into a main decision maker. Because we see so much analysis paralysis around pricing, mainly because people feel like they can only change it once in a lifetime. And then finally, this is the most tactical piece of advice I have, is utilizing what's called a multi-price mindset. And that basically means just making sure that you have multiple prices. And the reason that this is so important is because this is essentially a growth graph, breaking out essentially growth from new users and growth from existing users. And what you'll notice in so many companies is this essentially relationship that you see in this graph, where growth from existing users in terms of dollar amount is always going down, and growth from new users is obviously always going up. And the problem with this is that if you have this kind of relationship in those graphs, you're never going to get to net negative churn. You're always going to be losing money, and you're going to have to work so much harder to keep pushing people into that new bucket and acquiring new customers to account for the inevitable gross churn that you have on those existing customers. And the way that you can do this is basically by looking at your demand curve. So it doesn't have to be super complicated. I know a lot of people haven't seen this since high school or college. But if you only have one price point, you're only having that one entry point. When in reality, there's plenty of people who are willing to pay more or willing to pay less for your product, given different kind of changes in your product. So one way to do this, which is very, very common, is to just differentiate on features. So this is pretty straightforward. We've all seen pricing pages. Align those different personas to those different plans, and basically make sure that basic is Startup Steve, mid-market Mary gets Plus, and then premium goes to Enterprise Eddie. The other kind of more nuanced way to do it is using what's called a value metric. So a value metric is something that you charge for. Like the most common one you'll see, which isn't always the best one for most businesses, are per user pricing. So you'll see this with Slack, with Salesforce, a lot of different companies. But with other companies that don't necessarily have value tied to an additional user, it's a little bit harder to find. So this is a company called Wistia, as I mentioned. This is an older pricing page of theirs, but basically their value metric is the number of videos as well as the amount of bandwidth. And what's really interesting about this is they figured out the exact triggers for when someone should jump to the $99 plan, or $79 if paid annually, and then when someone should jump to the $299 or $239 plan. And it's really, really great because you take advantage of that whole demand curve, essentially. And some good ways to look at a value metric is you want to make sure it aligns to your customer's needs. So really what they're consuming, you should be charging on. It's got to grow with your customer. You never want the Disney Channel and then some small startup paying the exact same price for different scaled usage of your product. And then finally, it's got to be easy to understand. And that's probably the kicker. That's the hardest one. Because so many products, it's like, oh, if we make them more money, that's where our value is. But it's so hard to measure and understand that particular value metric. So long story short, acquisition is extremely important. but it's not the only thing that you should be working on. And you should really be looking at monetization and how you're actually bringing in cash from your users as another lever of growth. In terms of resources, you can find these slides at that link right there. Anyone's free to email me, of course, and then there's a couple of Twitter handles. We tweet about SaaS insights all the time, particularly around monetization. So appreciate it.